rather very quickly give you a brief survey of how we have come to 2017 and some of the events that we see unfolding around us, dealing with the racial circumstances we have. Now, as I've stated already, the United States has 45 million black people living in our nation. Now, they represent something distinct from the other races in our nation, unfortunately, in my view. Now, we have a lot of Asians in our nation. And you'll see this was true in England as well. Asians work.
Yeah.
Asians study.
Yeah.
Asians obey the laws.
Yeah.
Asians can take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And in some respects, Asians do make a contribution to the larger economic picture of our life, of our nation. Even the Mexicans. I have no great fondness for them. Although I don't hate them, I just don't want them to take my inheritance.
Amen.
They don't have much fondness for me, I can believe. No matter what I say. But I have to give them credit. They will work. They will learn. Regretfully, I don't mean this with a hateful spirit, but regretfully, our society the last 75 years has created a dependent class.
Yes. Yes.
Most of the 45 million people living in this nation that are Negro are an underclass. Now, I don't think they necessarily have to be an underclass. 70% of their children are born out of wedlock. It did not used to be that way in 1920.
That's true.
In 1920, black communities had fathers in the home.
Amen.
In 1920s, the black communities were moving forward economically.
Yes.
But, in the great wisdom of the Fabians and the other socialists who want to help people, they have encouraged the black man now to become dependent, to become lazy, to become covetous, and we now have essentially an underclass, a 45 million number of Negro underclass in this country that are more or less, I hate to say this, dead weight on our society. Which is very different from England. They don't have an underclass like we do, that we have to drag along like a ball and chain in terms of financing everything in this nation. And this didn't have to be. The black man can work, he can learn, he can do things, and they were doing that in the 1920s. They were making great progress until the welfare state began to develop. Until the welfare state began to say, listen, if you don't have a father, we're going to give you money. We're going to let the government be the father. And if you're not getting ahead economically, you need to understand it's not your fault. No, it's not your fault. You can just sit there. You don't have to study. You don't have to work. You don't have to learn. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is just sit back and wait. And we're going to eventually take the wealth of the white men and we're going to give it to you. Just sit there and it'll happen. And of course, that's what's unfolding right now. And that's a pity. It's a pity for the Negro and for the black man in our country, as well as for you and I. And the forces that want to see us destroyed have been driving a wedge in between us and making and creating a problem bigger than what it might otherwise and could have been. Well, let's just look back at some of the racial changing circumstances. In the 1930s, a decision was made in which the illegals would be counted when we reapportioned for representation. Congress extensively debated whether the issue is whether legal residents and non-citizens should be counted for apportionment. It was finally decided to include all of them. Of course, that was in the days before we had massive illegal immigration. What that does mean is that the representation in Congress is now greater for states that have large numbers of illegals. Even if they don't vote, they're counted for apportionment in Congress. In 1965, we have the Immigration Act. Oh my goodness. The 1965 Immigration Act, it floods the United States with 1 million non-whites a year. Let me read a quotation from Senator Edward Kennedy. Oh my goodness, I wish I could say God rest his soul, but I just can't quite get those words out.
Amen.
On the floor of the Senate, he said this. And I quote, "What this bill will not do. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, Senate Bill 500 will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or area, or the most populated and economically deprived nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As one writer said, every one of these assurances of the proponents of the 1965 Immigration Act have proved false. Immigration levels did surge upward. They are now running at about 1 million a year. So since 1965, we've been getting about 1 million more immigrants, that's legal immigrants, into our nation. And that is, as all of you know, that is a great problem. And of course, either Senator Kennedy was a liar or a fool, probably both.
Yeah.
Amen.
In 1975, the Voting Rights Act was amended to require election officials to provide bilingual ballots and voting materials in any district where 5% of the citizens of the voting age were members of a single minority group. So we now have bilingual ballots required in many states. In the 1990s, we began to extend voting rights to non-citizens, and in many states and in communities in our nation, non-citizens now have the right to vote. Places like Washington, D.C. and Maryland and other places. One of the things we need to consider is this. In the United States, in terms of historic definitions, for much of our period of history, it is fair to say that we have been a nation. Now, what is a nation? When I use that word nation, what do I mean? Well, let me give you something. A definition. A nation is a mass of people that share a common language, culture, and most importantly, a common ethnic bond. Yes. That is a nation. A common language, a common culture, and a common ethnic bond. Now, up until the 1965 Immigration Act, the United States was essentially 90% English, white-speaking folk. We had been that since the beginning. From 1775 until 1965, we were pretty constant at about 90% English, white-speaking folk.
Yes.
We are now, what was the number I told you to remember? 63% English, white-speaking folk. It means we've been losing about 0.6% per year. Remember that. But returning to our thoughts regarding the nation. The United States is gradually undergoing a historic mutation. It is gradually changing from what it has been since its inception, a nation, to what it is going to be, which is essentially an empire, a multicultural empire. When I say empire, I'm not talking about far-flung places like we have troops in South Korea or anything like that. I'm talking about our 48 contiguous states. We are moving and we are developing into an empire. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? All right? Empires are different than nations. Nations have a common culture, language, and ethnic bond. Empires are political units that do not have. It's a political unit that does not have a common language, culture, and ethnic bond. Now, there are many empires in history. I mean, we could talk about one that used to be well known, say the Austro-Hungarian Empire, maybe from some old history book you remember that thing. Well, that was an empire in which it had a number of ethnic groups, a number of language groups, a number of culture groups, and even some different racial distinctions within that empire. And eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire split apart. And the United States is undergoing its transition. A transition from what it was to what it is. Okay. Now, a true nation is inherently stable because of the many common bonds that cause the ethnically homogeneous population to share a similar worldview. Empires are inherently unstable because of the numerous competing cultures, ethnicities, and languages. Now, the gradual transition of a nation into a fractious empire does have historic precedent. Let me give you probably one of the best historic precedents that we could point at in recent centuries. And that would be what we nowadays call the Soviet Union. Now, most of us in this age, John, remember the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union once met essentially a pretty good definition of a nation. But things changed. And it doesn't really have to do as much with economics as we would like to say. There's certainly economic issues there, of course. But let's look at it from an ethnic point of view, a racial point of view. In 1950, the Russians made up 75% of all the population in the Soviet Union. One great big country, Soviet Union, one big political unit. 75% of everybody living in that great big political unit were ethnic Russians. They spoke the same language. They had the same race. They were having, issues dealing with religion, but they were one big ethnic group. We're looking at the issue of race today. Well, the Russians had a little problem. The problem they had is that they did not want to have large families. And back in the 1950s and 60s, the Russians were having 1 or 2 children per family. So while the Russian ethnic population was slowly slipping a bit, other ethnicities in this one great political unit were not having that trouble. And they were having large numbers of children. And the 75% gradually diminished from 75% in 1950 to 55% in 1990. 55%. Now, when the Russian Federation, when the Soviet Empire, shall we call it now, we'll call it an empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they had deep economic problems. But those economic problems do not explain why when the Soviet nation collapsed, it suddenly broke up into 15 nations. Where there was one political unit, there became 15. That has nothing to do with economics. It has to do with race. There'll be folks who want to say, no, it was all economics. No, friend, it was race. It was race. It broke up because they dropped to 55%. And the Russian, the core of who they were shrinking until the core couldn't hold the edges. I don't know if this makes any sense to you. I hope it does.
Yes,
I'm telling you the gospel truth, and I've read and studied this a lot. So just, I know this is a very accurate point of view. It was not economics that divided the Soviet Union into a host of smaller nations, but the inability of the Russians to maintain a powerful ethnic majority. Today, Russia is essentially a rump republic. Now, at what point is an ethnic majority no longer able to impose the cultural standards upon a minority to maintain internal stability? Now, this is a very important question for you and I. Now, I want you to start thinking about the United States of America right now. Right now, in the history of the United States and what I've told you so far. I told you in the 1960s we were 90% white English-speaking people. We are now 63% white English-speaking people. I want you to think about that gradual trend that we've seen over the last 40 years and think. Follow me. Don't get lost in the numbers, but just follow the general trend line. And here's the question. At what point does an ethnic majority no longer will be able to impose their cultural standards upon a minority to maintain internal stability? What is that point? Does it have anything to do with ethnicity? It has everything to do with ethnicity. Everything to do with race. Now, let me go to Europe as a case study. Now, try to follow me. Right now, there are 39 countries in Europe. 18 of those countries are primarily ethnically homogeneous, ethnically unified. That means they have an ethnic majority that is near or about 90% or higher. That is, the ethnic racial minorities are small. Now, of those 18 nations, only one has had internal domestic strife in recent years. 17 of 18 of them are internally very peaceful and tranquil. Doesn't have anything to do with economics. Some of them are economically prosperous. Some of them are economically down in the dumps. Nothing to do with economics. It has to do with race and ethnicity. Now let's go to our category 2. Category 2, we have 11 countries that have a single ethnic dominance between 60 and 90%. 60 and 90. Of those 11, 4 of them in recent years have experienced severe domestic strife based on ethnic division, based on irredentism, based on secession. They have had severe internal ethnic strife. Now let's go to category 3. There are 8 countries that have less than 60% ethnic domination. A single ethnic dominance is 60% or less. Of those 8, 5 have experienced civil war, guerrilla war, secession, or irredentism just in the last decade. Now, do you see a trend? It's simple enough. The lower the percentage dominance of a single ethnic group, the greater is the probability for internal political strife, breakup, irredentism, civil war, guerrilla war, revolution, etc. When the figure sinks below 70%, the danger zone is being entered. Below 60%, the probability is high that there will be attempts at minority groups to gain autonomy through one of the methods that I have just stated. In the case of the Soviet Union, that fit perfectly. For them, the breaking point came in at 55%. At 55%, the center could not hold. The center can't hold the edges. Now, so history has examples of this transition from what you might define as a nation or define as an empire. And the United States is moving quickly from a nation to an empire. Amen. And the transition is not pretty. Now for us, again, we are 63%. We are falling rapidly. Some writers have called when we reach below 60, we will be entering the frightful 50s, the dangerous 50s. You know, I don't know, I don't think you have to be a super genius to see that this really is beginning to unfold in this nation. Amen. So I'm not a prophet, but you don't have to be a super genius if you just have a sense of ethnicity within you. Amen. To perceive that we have some really deep abiding problems. Let's explore some of these numbers just a little bit further, a little deeper. Let's take that 63% of Caucasian English speakers, that's non-Hispanic white folks in the United States. Let's break it down a little further. Let's take California. California is pretty shocking. In 1977, now to some of you, that seems like a long, long time ago. In the 1970s, I was in school, and I was a 6th grade, 7th grader. In the 1970s, California was 77% non-Hispanic white. 77%. That's a pretty healthy majority. Pretty healthy majority. They are now, in 2015, about 40 years later, non-Hispanic whites in California are 38%. 38%. Wow. California, whites are not only are they no longer the majority, that is over 50%, they are no longer even what they call a plurality. In 2014, Hispanics have taken over as the majority ethnic group in California. Amen. There are 4 states now, right now. There are now 4 states where white people, non-Hispanic whites, that's people like you and I, where we are now below 50% of the population. Obviously, California is one. The next one is New Mexico. Then we have Hawaii. And number 4 is Texas. A few not far behind those 4. We'd like to do a quicker, a more in-depth study of Texas. Let's take a city in Texas and look at this. Let's take Houston. Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States of America. The general large metro area. It's a big metro area. In the year 1960, Houston had a foreign-born population. It was 2.6%. 2.6% of Houston was foreign-born population. In 1970, 3%. Not much change. 1980, it was 9.8%. In 1990, it was 17.8%. In 2000, it was 23%. And in 2010, it is over 25% of the population of Houston is foreign-born. Now, Houston is a bit of a microcosm then for what's going on in our country. Now, I could multiply the examples, and many of you know that I could. So I won't go. But we could say that the present tensions are indicative of the future. The present tensions that we see are there for all of us. If you have any ethnic or racial sense about you or pride, you have looked with some alarm at the events of the last 2 weeks because you understand, we've already talked about that this morning, that these are indicative of much larger issues. Amen. It's not just a question of statutes. It's not just a question but it's a whole question of identity and who decides the important questions of something like, who are we? Where have we been? And where are we going? What are our values? Those are the real questions. And personally, I have no problem with every community deciding for themselves what statue they want in their park. Amen. I think that's fair and right and just. And certainly it's constitutional that every state and community should decide what statue they have in their park. Amen. And they should lawfully and respectfully make that decision. Fine. But that's not what we see here. We have modern-day Jacobins, the radicals from the French Revolution, and as someone mentioned already this morning, modern Bolsheviks from the 1970 Russian Revolution. And their theory is essentially destroy everything down to the ground. Everything must go. Everything must go. And you say, oh, no, you're overstating the case. I don't think. Say, it's just about those Confederates. It's just about those old Confederates who were, all those old slave owners. No. I don't think so. Perhaps some of you are aware that Christopher Columbus has been under attack in the last couple of weeks. In fact, poor Christopher Columbus has been under attack for several years. Because Christopher Columbus, he discovered a new country, the new world, and the Spanish, all those mean old Spanish conquistadors came in and just messed everything all up. After all, the New World was such a marvelous paradise. Marvelous paradise. Those fine people like the Aztecs practicing human sacrifice. Oh, how horrible for those Spaniards to come in and change their world. Christopher Columbus, what an evil man. Well, seriously, his all monuments to Christopher Columbus are under attack. How about this one? Probably some of you have heard about this one this week. This was new to me this week. U.S. Grant. Yes. Ulysses S. Grant. Oh, he's got his statue has to come down. It's in New York City. U.S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. Now, at first you might scratch your head if you know a little bit about history. You'd say, wait a minute. He was the Northern general that was probably most responsible for defeating